With the difficulties with lower VRAM graphics cards that we see, how long do you think it will take to see that issue start to creep up to 12 and even 16GB cards? For example, can you buy a 4080 now and be confident that you'll have a great experience with it, or would you buy a 1700 XTX to be safe? So sort of, the whole future-proofing yourself with VRAM. I think 12GB I'm not that sure about. So I guess what's put us, dare I say, almost at the forefront of this whole VRAM conversation, because obviously we've done a lot of content, we've talked about it at length now. But back when I reviewed the RTX 3070, I can't remember exactly what I said, but I said, look, seems like a pretty good value product at $500, getting some great features, nice performance uplift over the previous generation. My only concern with this product, and probably the reason why I wouldn't buy it, and this is what I said about the RTX 3070 in my day one review, is because it only has 8GB of VRAM. I'd like to see more VRAM at this price point, at this point in time. Then we reviewed the the RX 6800, and it had 16GB. I said, yeah, this is what I'd sort of expect out of an RTX 3070. Given that these, obviously the 6800 was a bit more expensive, but it had the rasterization performance to back up that price increase. So price to performance, they were pretty similar in that sense, but twice as much VRAM. I predicted that the 6800 would age better, given that we had next generation consoles and that landscape was shifting. So that was pretty much my initial push towards more VRAM on graphics cards, and that's turned out to be probably a pretty wise call, given how things have played out, and I expect that they will continue to. But I think 12GB for, what would you say, a 4060 Ti class product, that should be the minimum, because that's a pretty powerful GPU. And again, the whole how much VRAM do you need? Realistically, all GPUs, all current generation GPUs should have a minimum of 16, because you can use ultra quality textures regardless of how powerful the GPU is, and that gives you a really good visual improvement. So mark my words, a year from now, definitely 2 years from now, there'll be plenty of games that use 16GB VRAM buffers, somewhere in the 13GB to 16GB range, and they will look a lot better doing that. So if you had a crappy GPU, like a 6500 XT with 16GB, you could just max out the textures and it would look really good. You might only be playing at 40 frames per second on medium quality settings, but with those high quality textures, it would make the presentation look a lot better than it would otherwise on low or medium. So that's the advantage of the VRAM. The VRAMs are, again, it's a hard conversation, because how much VRAM you should put on a product is really heavily determined by the price of the product, which generally then determines the performance of the product. But typically speaking, the lowest quality textures, the highest quality textures has a very minimal impact on FPS performance. So it's kind of one of those things where it'd be nice to be able to just use maximum quality textures on everything, but you've got to be realistic about how much VRAM and the memory bus and all that stuff you have on the lower end products.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be expecting an entry-level low-tier card is probably going to deliver lower-tier visual quality. That's fair, and that's why I've sort of said that in a sort of $100 range, 8GB would still be appropriate, because it depends, obviously.
Yeah, for this generation, look, I could probably go as high as anything under $300, I'm pretty well okay with only 8GB. So if above $300 should have 12GB, $400 and above should be 16. And then beyond that, not too phased. So I think for this next generation and the next few generations of GPUs, you're not going to need more than 16GB, sort of like what we saw with 8GB being sufficient for a very long time, from way as far back as GTX 1070, I think it was 7 years ago now, something like that.
Yeah.
So from Pascal to about 2 years ago, I think 8GB was okay. But yeah, from probably the GeForce 30 series, because there's been a lot of games released like Halo and stuff like that play at really high frame rates using ultra quality settings, but they don't have enough VRAM to load all the textures in. I don't know, a lot of you guys have been complaining about this. I mentioned it originally when the 3070 was launched, but I didn't really investigate and look into it until much more recently. And a lot of you have been complaining to me over the last few years that there's been games you've been playing and you've been having texture problems, or the game started stuttering after 40 minutes of gameplay because you ran out of VRAM. So it's been a problem for a while now. It's not just, a lot of people like to try and say it's these unoptimized games like, if it wasn't for The Last of Us Part 1, this wouldn't be a problem. It's like, no, that's actually very wrong. It's been a problem for a while now. It's just that it's hard to test for. It requires a lot of in-depth testing that reviewers don't necessarily do on an individual GPU. You really have to be specifically looking for that problem. But to answer your question, I don't think you have to go too crazy with the VRAM thing. It's no different to how it's been in the past. There's just games are starting to call for a certain amount of VRAM, and I really think 16 gigabytes is going to be that sweet spot moving forward over the next few years. And I don't know how many years, but it's probably going to be quite a few years before you can justify going beyond that, like what we're seeing now from 8 to 16.
Yeah, I think 16 gig now is going to last you until the next upgrade that you'd be considering, which is probably not the next generation, but the generation after. So probably around that 4 to 5 year range, I would expect. But I mean, with something like 12 gigabytes, is like that should enable in a lot of situations not the low quality setting textures. It's going to enable somewhere in the middle. So it's just, you're going to have to think about how acceptable is that to you. Like, are you going to be okay with some games running on ultra, but some being medium or high quality textures as opposed to the very top level? I think it's unlikely that 12 gigabytes will be like the bottom of the barrel, like super low quality textures anytime soon, whereas 8 gigabytes seems to be heading that way.
Yep.
So 12 gigabytes is like, you're making a compromise there. It's sort of like,
it's a bit too. So the RTX 4070 is a product that I don't mind. It's one of the better GPUs in my opinion from the 40 series. So, but then you've got the 4070 Ti at $800, and I think that's way too much to pay for a card with 12 gigabytes. Again, it'll be serviceable, like Tim's saying, but I think when we get a few years down the track, you'll probably wish you had 16 gigabytes because you don't want to be managing your VRAM. You don't want to be losing performance because you don't have enough VRAM. You want that VRAM to be a thing you don't worry about. It complicates the whole process. Like we've seen, like with the RTX 4060 Ti, it's kind of crazy to see games like Resident Evil 4, The Last of Us Part 1. What else there's a heap of other games in there, maybe Hogwarts, but there's a few other games in there and they play so well on the 16 gigabyte card. Like you get 100 FPS in, Resident Evil 4, and then the frame rate's all over the map with the 8 gigabyte version because you're having to, shuffle assets and it's running out of VRAM and having to manage that, and that occasionally introduces stuttering. There's just a whole heap of problems that can arise when not having enough VRAM.
You want I think with this aging thing, you want the VRAM capacity to age with the card. So if you're buying a card now and it's giving you ultra settings type experience, then sure, in 5 years, probably not going to be an ultra level card anymore. It's going to be medium. But you don't want to then have it go from ultra to medium quality settings generally, but then textures go down to low. And what we're seeing today is that there's games where you can use them at ultra settings, but with 8 gigabytes, you're sort of looking at medium to low quite quickly. So there could be games very shortly where otherwise you would see the ultra level performance, but with low level textures. So with 12 gigabytes, there is a chance that it's going to age a little bit better in terms of that card is going to be ultra now, and then maybe in a few years it's going to be high with high textures and then medium with medium textures. That would be graceful aging, but there's still a risk that towards the back end of that card's life that it may be a bit lower than that. Whereas I think with 16 gig, very much the level of performance you're getting from those cards is typically ultra level, and it's very likely to be ultra level textures throughout the lifespan of the cards. It's sort of like, it's better than gracefully aging. It's like, yes, the performance is going to dip down over the years, and a 4080 is going to be more of a mid-tier card in 4 or 5 years in performance, but then hopefully that VRAM, is giving you that ultra settings textures for quite a while. So again, sort of that balance. I think 12 gig is, as you say, for a 3070, it's a mid-range, even though people cringe at $600 being mid-range, but it's mid to high end. You're using it with ultra now. It's probably going to be gracefully aging to high and medium with a texture quality reduction over time, but hopefully far enough in the future. Yeah,
I think with this current generation, we're at the start of 16 gigabytes, sort of being what you would want to have moving forward. And we're well and truly at the end of 8 gigabytes being sufficient for high-end gaming, even at 1080p. That's really where we are. And we've sort of been making that transition over the last few years. And while some people argue that, we're not there yet, I think we are. That, in my opinion, we are. And you're going to see just more of that over the next 2 years. So I would not be buying an 8GB RTX 4060 Ti. That is going to be the absolute... apart from the fact that it's a bad value, not good product that is worse than the 3060 Ti in a number of rasterization titles, apart from the fact that it's a really bad product, the 8GB version's horrifically bad, terrible investment. It's going to age terribly, while the 16GB version should not be purchased at $100 US premium and is also a terrible product at $500. If I had the option of having to buy one of those products, a $400 8GB card or a $500 16GB card, as much as it would suck, I'd buy the $500 card because it's just going to be a much better product now and in the future. Again, most of the games that we have available right now do not require more than 8GB, especially with reasonable quality settings. And you can play pretty much all games on an 8GB card. Again, stuff like Halo, you can dial that down and get it, you shouldn't need to dial it down because the frame rate's already really high on Ultra, but you can make it work. But I think 2 years from now, you're going to be regretting saving the $100 US. But ultimately, you probably shouldn't buy either. You should probably look at something like an Radeon RX 6800 XT, something along those lines.
Used GPUs.
Oh, yeah.
You can get a used 2080 Ti for less than...
Well, yeah. Used 2080 Ti is a much better product. So anyway, there are options out there. 4060 Ti is definitely not it. Have we answered this one?
Yep.
6 times? 6 different
Probably.
ways? Cool.
Yep.
We'll move on.